Hey everybody, it's Pastor Siri. I am a Lutheran pastor and a spiritual seeker, and today I want to talk about my journey and experience in the Jesus Cave in India. Take a listen. So last February, I went to India for 2 weeks, and I spent most of the time in the northeastern section, flying into Delhi, spending some time in Varanasi, and then Agra, and then Rishikesh, which probably was one of my favorite places because one day, which happened to be on my birthday, y'all, that was so cool when I found out. Here I am on this yoga retreat with other yogis, and we're learning about Hinduism and the feminist goddess part of Hinduism, which was cool. And here I am, a pastor, and I find out we're going to this cave that is sometimes called the Jesus Cave, and it's on my birthday. I was so excited. So to me, that was such a beautiful message that in some ways was saying, yes, learn, go, explore, seek, understand other faiths, learn other places, because I'm such a bridge builder in that way. I want to know about other faiths and spiritualities, and I honor them. And everywhere I go, it's like Jesus follows me, and it's like, I know them. Let's play here. We're all friends here. And so on my birthday, we went to the Jesus Cave. And so, first thing I just want to say is that this is outside of Rishikesh, and it's called Arundhati Cave. It is a cave that already exists. There's two caves that are very close to each other that were said to be the meditation center of a husband and wife who lived a very long time ago. And it's a beautiful, beautiful love story. And yet there's this interesting mythology that kind of goes along with one of these caves, the Vishashta Guha, as being a cave where Jesus meditated. And how this kind of came about was there were two gurus, very separate times, who came and meditated in that, and they had a vision of a man who clearly was an Indian separately, and they realized later that this person was Jesus, and they felt a very strong presence of him in this cave. And so this sort of became secondhand the Jesus Cave. So on my birthday, I went into the cave, and I spent some time meditating, and it was a really lovely experience. I had to leave because a tourist group came in, and it got really crammed. It was such a small space, and I was feeling very claustrophobic. And then after wandering around the beautiful, just so quiet and full of nature, I ended up going in an adjacent little cave. So the picture you're going to see of me isn't technically the Jesus Cave, it's an adjacent cave, but I got to spend a little bit more time there where other people weren't trying to come in. And as I looked out, because they both have the same perspective, the Jesus Cave and the cave I was in both would have the same perspective of the valley with the mountains. And I just sat there thinking, me here from the United States, from Minnesota, this is the first time in my life where I may be in the exact physical place of Jesus of Nazareth that he may have been at the same time, separated by 2,000 years. To me, that's absolutely beautiful and profound. Now, where does this idea come from? While I was in India for my birthday, some of the women who were on the trip sprung me this sweet book, Jesus Lived in India, and I read it very quickly. It was very fascinating. There are some really interesting things in here. It kind of went into all sorts of stuff like the Shroud of Turin, which honestly I knew very little about, and all sorts of historical stuff about Jesus that's not necessarily biblical. And one of the how he starts out with this with his book is he talks about a man named Nikolai Norovich, I hope I'm saying that someone right, who in 1887 went to the Himalayas state of Kashmir and to the Happy Valley, which is in northern India. And he went to a Buddhist monastery, and as he went up the mountains and was talking to this Buddhist monk, they got in a conversation, and out came this like idea that there had been a man named Isa, which is very close to the Yeshua of Aramaic, who had been there at the time that Jesus lived, who was not an Indian, who had come from Palestine, and was said to be a son of Buddha, who was said to be very knowledgeable in spiritual truths, who was a powerhouse in his own way. Well, this really intrigued Nikolai, and so he actually went to another monastery where they had a scroll with the documentation and the mention of a young teenager who was traveling with merchants and on his way on the Silk Road, and came and was this, again, learned a lot and was this sort of powerhouse of spirituality and of faith. What's interesting about the traveling with merchants is that then I read a different book, and this is all extra biblical stuff, so some of you automatically dismiss that, and that's okay. For me, this is fascinating just to ponder what might be. So there was this other book that talked a lot about Joseph of Arimathea, and to be honest, I really hadn't thought too much about him. He's a positive figure in the gospel stories who gives the tomb to Jesus after he dies. But this went in very, very deeply and said that Joseph of Arimathea was a tin trader, that there are all these stories from early Britain about Joseph the Tin Man and him bringing like his young nephew with him, or his great nephew with him. And there's this idea that Joseph of Arimathea was like the great uncle of Jesus and had wealth and money. And so Jesus would go with him on travels and get exposed to the larger world and other languages and other people. And I thought, that's actually really kind of interesting that Jesus in some ways could have been really worldly, really kind of known what was out there in the big, wider world, and really opened him up in a big, broad way so that he could see things really, really clearly. The book also talks about how, if you remember from the Gospel of Matthew, when Herod attempts to kill all of the children under the age of 3 because he's threatened by a baby, go tyranny, and so Joseph takes his family and lives for many years for about 3-5 years in Egypt. And in Egypt, in Alexandria, there was a large kind of expat community of Jews. But Alexandria was super cosmopolitan. There were, like I said, a Jewish neighborhood. There were Buddhists who called themselves logicians. And there basically would have been a lot of different thoughts there. And so it's very possible that even at a young age, Jesus was exposed to a language other than Hebrew and Aramaic, as well as to other thoughts beyond just Judaism. And as we know, between the ages of 12 and 30, the Bible says absolutely nothing. These are called the lost years. And there's this tradition that some people love and some people get really irritated by, that Jesus spent part of that time in India. So even though I'd heard that idea, I'd never thought about the fact that there might be some evidence that Jesus had been in India. And this book also talks about, which some of you may really not like, and this is okay. It's okay, you can dismiss all of this. I'm not telling you what to think, I'm just sharing this process of learning that came from finding out I was going to the Jesus cave in India. That Jesus, after his crucifixion, was like, well, that went interestingly. I'm going back to India where things were a little calmer for me. And that he lived 40 to 50 years afterwards. And it was interesting. I'm not going to go through all the details, but he talks about all of these written scrolls and stories about this man in the time period after the crucifixion and resurrection, of this wise, compassionate, loving man who was living alone in these little villages in northern India, in Kashmir. And they have all of these stories of this man. They even have a tomb, which is very different from what traditional Christians think. We think that he floated off in the sky because that's what Acts says. That's the ascension that happens 40 days after the resurrection. Now, there's criticisms of the belief that Jesus could have spent any time in India. And the biggest one that I've heard is that this belief of like, isn't Judaism a rich enough faith that you can be enlightened through Judaism? And I think, that's valid to say that yes, Judaism is very rich. And there's depth to it. There's mysticism, Kabbalah, all of these beautiful things that come from the Jewish faith. So yes, I believe you can go deep into almost every faith, far deeper than what most people sit. So, of course, it is not a diminishment of Judaism or of any faith or an elevation. This isn't an us versus them, that Hinduism or Buddhism is better than Judaism. To me, rather, and this comes from my own personal experience, when you learn about another faith and when you learn some of the techniques and chants and prayers and perspectives, you just start to think more about your own faith. It enriches your own faith. It opens it up in a big, beautiful way. So contrast can be a really great way to go deeper in your own faith. So it's not to say Jesus was a Buddhist or he was a Hindu who'd reached enlightenment, but rather that in his own Jewish faith, he could also see that the richness, that he was opened up a little bit more to some of those mystical elements that might have been in his own faith. But I also want to mention the fact that I believe truth is truth is truth is truth, and it can be found all over the place. Jesus is speaking in his ministry from his own enlightenment experience, his own gaining of spiritual truth, and that's going to be seen and recognized by people of other faiths in their own language and in their own way. So a Buddhist would say he's enlightened and he's a bodhisattva. And a Hindu guru might look at the stories of Jesus and go, yep, this is a guru who has attained, samadhi and has come back to help and guide others. People will have their own language, but it also just shows me that it's like down on the ground, we have all these boundaries of our faith. And there's a rigidity, kind of like the borders that we create in the world. Minnesota is separated from Wisconsin and this faith and this country, and we have these borders. But the truth is, when you float up, they don't exist except in our mind. And so when you look at the core of truth, the core of what's out there, of God, the universe, and mystery, no singular faith is going to be able to contain that. So Jesus grew up in Judaism. He's speaking in Judaism, but what the spiritual truths that he's trying to teach, while he might be using Jewish language, they're coming from something way bigger than that. And I believe that's true of anyone who's sort of seen something bigger and deeper, is you're struggling to put it into words. People who have near-death experiences or visions of God, visions of angels who've had a deeply profound experience, they struggle to put it into words, and they also realize that no religion can contain the fullness of what's out there. So I guess to me, it doesn't diminish Judaism, it doesn't diminish any faith. Truth is truth, and spiritual experience and oneness with God is a universal experience. That's the other thing that I think is really profound, is meditation, chanting, prayer, drumming, visions, experiences of oneness with God are universal. They do not belong just to one group or another. They may look different in one place or another, or one group may suppress one aspect if a certain power comes into play. The deeper you go into spirituality and mysticism, the more the lines of religion start to blur. That's kind of what I've observed. The second reason that people may not like this, all of this, is because it's not in the Bible. And for some people, that's sort of the end-all be-all. They're like, well, it's just speculation. And so, just because we have these traditions and stories doesn't necessarily mean we have to believe it. And you're absolutely right, you don't have to believe anything. And yet there's a lot that's not in the Bible. We don't know what Jesus did between the ages of 12 and 30. He could have just been a carpenter the entire time, apprenticing with his father. He could have gone through all of the schooling and to rabbinical school thus earning the title rabbi, which he was called. He could have also traveled around with his uncle Joseph of Arimathea or something else. We don't know, and I don't have any need to argue with anyone about it. I just find it fascinating to wonder. But again, there's so much we don't know about the Bible. For example, Mary Magdalene is clearly a powerhouse who I believe her role in the Gospels was minimized from what it really was. And after, in the book of Acts, pretty much after the resurrection, of which she was the witness to, there's no mention of her at all. She's not even mentioned in that core group of people in the upper room who are waiting before Pentecost. So where did she go and what happened? There's omissions for whatever reason, ignorance or intentional switching. We know that manuscripts are not identical in the earliest part of the church. We know that when the church came into power under Constantine, that there was a certain thrust that they wanted everybody to think and believe this particular way. And we know, because we see in manuscripts certain words and names and things crossed out and changed, that there was shifting and changing with some manuscripts. So simply just to dismiss something and saying, well, the Bible has got all the facts we need, there's no discrepancy in the Bible, is just ignorance. And to say that some of these really interesting stories about Mary Magdalene going to France and Joseph of Arimathea and Jesus going to India, to outrightly dismiss or accept, I think we just chew on all of it. I think we just hold it out and wonder together and continue to obviously look for evidence and other things like that. But at the same time, I love keeping an open mind and wondering what if. And if by chance I had found myself in the same space, the same physical space, looking at the same river and valley and mountains that Jesus had once been in, that is a wonderful blessing. And I'm so grateful for that perspective. But that's what I have for you. And I'd love to hear any thoughts or comments you might have below. So until next time, bye-bye.